the doors of the cathedral swung open at exactly the wrong moment. Zola Malungu stood at the altar, her hand resting in Kim Tae-jun's, the efficient mid-sentence. 400 guests holding their breath in the particular hush reserved for the moment, right before two people become one, when the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room slammed open with a sound like a gunshot. Every head turned. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, late afternoon sun blazing behind her, so that for one suspended second she looked less like a person, and more like a warning. Then, she stepped forward, and the light caught the sharp red of her dress, the sleek black hair pulled back from a face Zola recognized instantly. Even though she'd only ever seen it in photographs Tae-jun had never quite managed to fully explain away. Song Ji-woo. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," Ji-woo said, her voice carrying easily down the length of the aisle, sweet and venomous in equal measure. "But I couldn't let this wedding happen without saying something first." Tae-jun's hand tightened around Zola's, his entire body going rigid beside her. "Ji-woo, what are you doing here?" "What I should have done 6 months ago," Ji-woo said, walking slowly down the aisle now, her heels echoing sharply against marble, 400 guests turning to follow her progress like spectators at a match neither side had agreed to play. "I'm stopping you from making the biggest mistake of your life." Zola felt every eye in the cathedral shift toward her, the bride, standing at the altar in white, suddenly cast as the obstacle in someone else's love story rather than the center of her own. "Ji-woo, this is not the place," Tae-jun said, his voice low, urgent, mortified in a way Zola had never once seen him during 18 months of dating. "Whatever you think you're doing, I think I'm telling the truth," Ji-woo said, stopping now at the front pew, close enough that Zola could see the sharp, brittle confidence in her eyes, the kind that came from a woman who'd spent her entire adult life being told she was owed something. "Our families arranged this engagement 3 years ago, Tae-jun. Everyone in this room knows that. Half of them were at the engagement dinner." She turned, sweeping her gaze across the stunned guests. "And now he stands here, marrying a woman none of you had even heard of a year ago, pretending our history simply doesn't exist." A murmur rippled through the pews, some guests visibly uncomfortable, others leaning forward with undisguised curiosity, the particular hunger of people who sensed they were about to witness something they'd be describing at dinner parties for years. "Ji-woo," Tae-jun said again, sharper now, "we ended our engagement 2 years ago. You know exactly why." "Do I?" Ji-woo said, something dangerous entering her voice. "Or is that simply the version you've told yourself, so you don't have to sit with what actually happened?" Zola stood very still at the altar, her white gown catching the afternoon light streaming through the cathedral's tall windows, her bouquet trembling almost imperceptibly in her hands, the only visible sign, to anyone watching closely, of the storm rising beneath her calm exterior. She looked at Tae-jun's face, saw the genuine panic there, the particular helplessness of a man watching his past collide with his future in front of everyone who mattered to him. Then, she looked at Ji-woo, standing in the aisle in her sharp red dress, radiating the confidence of a woman who believed she still held every card in this room. Zola set her bouquet down slowly on the altar rail. "Miss Song," she said, her voice calm, clear, carrying easily through the stunned silence of the cathedral. "I believe you're about to tell this entire room a story about betrayal and broken promises." Ji-woo's chin lifted slightly, sensing an opening. "I am." "Before you do," Zola said, stepping down from the altar, moving toward the aisle with unhurried, deliberate grace, "I'd like to ask you something first. Just one question, and I'd like everyone in this room to hear your answer." 400 guests leaned forward as one, the cathedral holding its breath for the second time in 5 minutes, no longer certain, suddenly, which woman they were actually watching. Ji-woo's confident expression flickered, just slightly, at the shift in Zola's tone. She hadn't expected the bride to step toward her instead of shrinking back. "A question," Ji-woo repeated, recovering quickly, tilting her chin with practiced disdain. "Go ahead then, I have nothing to hide." "Good," Zola said evenly. "Then this should be easy for you." She stopped a few feet away, close enough now that the entire cathedral could see both women clearly, the bride in white, unshaken, and the woman in red, still radiating confidence that hadn't yet fully registered the ground shifting beneath her. Do you remember the name BWAM? The color drained slightly from Ji-woo's face, quick enough that only someone watching closely would have caught it. But Zola was watching closely, and so, she noted, was Tae-jun, his brow furrowing in confusion beside her. I don't see what that has to do with anything, Ji-woo said, her voice tightening. I think you do, Zola said calmly. But since the room doesn't know the name, let me explain. BWAM was Tae-jun's assistant 3 years ago, around the same time your families were finalizing your engagement. Zola paused, letting the words land, watching Ji-woo's composure begin, almost imperceptibly, to crack. She resigned suddenly, without explanation, 2 months before your engagement dinner. No one at the company ever knew why. I only found out because she reached out to me directly, 6 months ago, after seeing photos of Tae-jun and me together online. This is irrelevant, Ji-woo said quickly, too quickly, the sharpness in her voice now edged with something closer to alarm. Ancient office gossip has nothing to do with why I'm here today. She reached out. Zola continued, unhurried, because she wanted to warn me. Not about Tae-jun. Zola turned slightly, addressing the room now as much as Ji-woo. About you, Miss Song. The cathedral had gone utterly silent, 400 guests suspended in a stillness so complete Zola could hear the faint rustle of Ji-woo's dress as she shifted her weight, the first physical sign of someone losing her footing. BWAM told me, Zola said, that you'd discovered she and Tae-jun had grown close during a project. Nothing romantic, she was very clear about that, and so was he, when I later asked him directly. But you didn't believe that distinction mattered. You went to her personally, and you made it clear that if she didn't resign quietly, you'd ensure every company in this industry heard a very different, very damaging version of events about her conduct. A version untrue, but difficult to disprove once whispered into the right ears. That's a lie, Ji-woo said, but her voice had lost its earlier venom, replaced now by something brittler, more defensive. Is it? Zola asked quietly. Because I have the messages, Miss Song BWAM kept everything, every text, every email, every carefully worded threat you thought was vague enough to be deniable. She sent them to me 6 months ago, not to hurt you, but because she was afraid I might end up in the same position she did, and she wanted someone to actually know the truth before it happened again. Tae-jun's face had shifted from confusion to something colder, harder, as the pieces assembled themselves in real time. BWAM left because of you, he said slowly, staring at Ji-woo like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. I asked her directly why she resigned. She told me it was a family matter. I believed her. Tae-jun Ji-woo started, but he cut her off, something in his voice Zola had never heard directed at anyone before. You threatened someone's career, Tae-jun said, over a professional friendship that meant nothing. Because you couldn't tolerate the idea of me spending time with anyone you hadn't personally approved. And you've spent 2 years letting me believe our engagement simply fell apart over incompatibility, when the entire time, you were the reason a good employee lost her job and her reputation for something she never did. I was protecting what was mine, Ji-woo said, her voice rising now, the composed mask fully cracking. You don't understand what it's like, Tae-jun, being raised to believe your entire future is secured, only to watch someone constantly threaten to take it from you. BWAM never threatened anything, Zola said quietly, cutting through Ji-woo's rising defensiveness, with steady, unwavering calm. She was good at her job. She respected Tae-jun as a colleague. That's the entire threat you invented in your own mind, Miss Song, and then acted on with real devastating consequences for a woman who did nothing except exist near someone you'd already decided belonged to you. The cathedral remained silent, but the quality of the silence had shifted entirely, no longer the hungry, curious silence of guests waiting for scandal, but something more uncomfortable, more aware, as 400 people began quietly recalculating exactly who had walked into this wedding as the villain of the story. Ji-woo looked around the room slowly, seeming to register, perhaps for the first time, the shift in every face watching her. The sympathetic murmurs that had greeted her dramatic entrance had evaporated entirely, replaced by something closer to cold, assessing silence. "You've made your point," Jiwoo said finally, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier theatrical confidence. "Congratulations, you've humiliated me in front of everyone I know." "I didn't humiliate you, Miss Song," Zola said quietly, and something in her tone carried more weight than anger would have. "You walked into my wedding to humiliate me. I simply told the truth instead of letting you tell a lie. Those aren't the same thing, even if they feel similar, standing where you're standing right now." Jiwoo stood frozen in the aisle, her earlier confidence entirely dismantled. 400 guests watching in a silence so complete Zola could hear her own heartbeat. Then, from the back of the cathedral, a new voice cut through the stillness, quiet, hesitant, but carrying clearly in the silence. "She's telling the truth." Every head turned toward the cathedral's entrance, where a woman none of them recognized stood in the doorway, still catching her breath, having clearly run to arrive at exactly this moment. BWAM had come to speak for herself. The cathedral's collective attention swung toward the doorway, 400 guests craning to see the woman standing there, mid-30s, composed but visibly shaken. Her chest rising and falling from what had clearly been a sprint from the parking area. "BWAM," Taejun said, stunned. "How did you? Zola called me an hour ago," BWAM said, walking slowly down the aisle now, her eyes fixed on Jiwoo with a steadiness that seemed to cost her considerable effort. "She said Jiwoo might try something today. I didn't believe it would actually happen." She stopped a few feet from where Jiwoo stood, close enough now that the two women faced each other directly for what Zola suspected was the first time in 2 years. "But I wasn't going to let her tell this story without me in the room." Jiwoo's composure, already fractured, seemed to collapse further under the weight of BWAM's presence, proof, standing in the flesh, that the version of events she'd carefully avoided for 2 years had just walked through the door to contradict her. "BWAM," Jiwoo said, her voice unsteady now, "you don't need to do this. Whatever you think you remember, I remember everything." BWAM said quietly, cutting her off. "I remember the message you sent me, telling me you'd make sure I never worked in finance in this city again if I didn't resign within the week. I remember sitting in my car afterward, unable to stop shaking, trying to figure out how to explain to my parents why I was suddenly unemployed, when I hadn't done anything wrong except be good at my job and easy to work with." She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone with hands that trembled slightly. "I kept everything, Jiwoo. Every message. I told myself for 2 years I'd never need them, that I just wanted to move on. But some part of me knew, I think, that someday someone would need to hear the truth." She held the phone out, not to Jiwoo, but to the room. Turning slowly so several nearby guests could see the illuminated screen, a long thread of messages. Dates clearly visible, threats laid bare in Jiwoo's own words. A guest near the front pew, an older woman Zola recognized from Taejun's side of the family, gasped audibly. "This is a private matter," Jiwoo said desperately, her voice climbing toward panic now. "This has nothing to do with anyone else in this room. You made it everyone's business," Taejun said, stepping forward now, his voice carrying the particular coldness of someone recalibrating years of assumed history in real time. "The moment you walk through those doors to publicly accuse the woman I'm marrying of stealing something that was never yours to begin with." He looked at BWAM, something genuinely apologetic entering his expression. "BWAM, I am so sorry. I should have pushed harder when you resigned. I should have asked more questions instead of accepting the easy answer." "You didn't know," BWAM said gently. "I made sure you didn't know. I was scared, Taejun." Jiwoo made it very clear what would happen if I told anyone the real reason. Jiwoo looked around the cathedral one final time, taking in the faces of people she'd known for years, family friends, business associates, members of Korea's social elite who had, until 11 minutes ago, considered her the wronged party in a story she'd apparently been rehearsing for 2 years. Now every single one of them looked at her with something between disbelief and quiet contempt. "I loved you," Jiwoo said suddenly, turning to Taejun, her voice cracking with something that sounded, for the first time, genuinely raw rather than calculated. "I know that doesn't excuse what I did. But I loved you, and I watched our families plan a future together for 3 years. And then I watched you fall for someone else so quickly it felt like everything I'd believed about my own life was suddenly worthless. That's not love, Jiwoo, Taejun said quietly, something almost sad entering his voice now beneath the anger. That's possession. You didn't lose me because I fell for Zola. You lost me the moment you decided threatening an innocent woman's career was an acceptable price for protecting your own comfort. Jiwoo's eyes filled with tears she seemed to be fighting desperately to hold back. 400 guests watching in a silence that had shifted, once again, into something almost unbearably intimate for a room this size. Zola stepped forward one final time, her white gown catching the light streaming through the cathedral's tall windows, and looked directly at Jiwoo with an expression that held no triumph, only tired, clear-eyed finality. "Miss Song," she said quietly, "I understand losing something you believed was owed to you feels unbearable. But you cannot rebuild your own sense of worth by destroying someone else's, and you cannot walk into my wedding and demand I carry the weight of a story that was never mine to fix." She paused. "I think you should leave now. Not because this room has turned against you, though it clearly has. Because you deserve the chance to figure out who you are when you're not performing wrong devotion in front of an audience that's already made up its mind." The cathedral remained silent as Jiwoo looked around one final time, searching, perhaps, for a single sympathetic face among 400 guests, and finding none. She turned and walked back down the aisle, her earlier confident stride now stripped of all its performance, her red dress the only bright color in a room that had gone entirely, uncomfortably still. The heavy wooden doors closed behind her with a quiet, anticlimactic click, nothing like the dramatic slam that had announced her arrival less than 15 minutes earlier. BWAM remained standing at the front of the cathedral, looking suddenly uncertain now that the confrontation had ended, as if the adrenaline that had carried her through the door had abruptly run out. "I'm sorry for interrupting your wedding," she said quietly to Zola. "I didn't want to make a spectacle. I just couldn't let her lie." "You didn't interrupt anything," Zola said gently, reaching out to take BWAM's hand. "You corrected something that should have been corrected 2 years ago. There's a difference." She looked around at the stunned, silent cathedral, then back at Taejun, who was watching her with an expression somewhere between awe and overwhelming relief. "Now," Zola said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through her composure, "if everyone doesn't mind, I believe there's still a wedding happening." A ripple of relieved, slightly disbelieving laughter moved through the pews, tension breaking at last. But as the officiant cleared his throat to resume the ceremony, Zola caught sight of Taejun's mother in the front row, a woman who had, until this exact moment, remained conspicuously, tellingly silent throughout the entire confrontation, her face unreadable in a way that made something uneasy settle in Zola's stomach. She would think about that later. Right now, there was a wedding to finish. The officiant, visibly rattled but professionally composed, cleared his throat a second time. "Shall we continue where we left off?" Zola returned to the altar, Taejun's hand finding hers again, steadier now than it had been 15 minutes earlier, though something in his eyes still carried the weight of what had just happened. BWAM slipped quietly into an empty seat near the back, and slowly, the cathedral's held breath began to release into something resembling normalcy. They made it through the vows. Zola would remember. Later, very little of the specific words, only the steadiness of Taejun's voice, the warmth of his hands around hers, and the persistent, nagging awareness of his mother's face in the front row, composed and unreadable, in a way that felt less like shock and more like calculation. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the cathedral erupted into genuine applause, relieved, enthusiastic, the particular energy of 400 people who'd just witnessed something they'd be discussing for years, and were grateful, above all, that it had ended well. But as Zola and Taejun turned to walk back down the aisle as husband and wife, she saw his mother rise from the front pew, not to embrace them, not to celebrate, but to step deliberately into their path. "Ima," Taejun said, surprised, "we should get to the reception. Everyone's A-word." Kong Mi-suk said quietly, her voice carrying none of the warmth appropriate for the moment, only careful, controlled tension. Both of you. Now, she led them to a small antechamber off the main hall, away from curious eyes, and closed the door firmly behind them. Mother, Taejun began. Whatever this is, can it wait until did you know? Mi-suk asked, cutting him off, her eyes fixed on Zola now with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly much smaller. About BWAM. About what Jiwoo did to her. Before today, did either of you know? I knew, Zola said carefully. BWAM told me 6 months ago. And you said nothing, Mi-suk said, to me, or to my husband, for 6 months, while our families continued treating the Song family with the respect owed to close business partners. I didn't think it was my place to expose someone else's private trauma for the sake of social positioning. Mrs. Kang, Zola said evenly. BWAM asked me to keep it quiet. I only involved her today because Jiwoo forced the issue by showing up uninvited. Mi-suk studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her composed expression. Do you understand what you've done today? The Song family has been essential business partners to this family for over a decade. Jiwoo's father sits on the board of 3 companies we depend on for critical supply contracts. You didn't just embarrass one woman in front of 400 guests, Zola. You may have just detonated relationships this family has spent years carefully building. With respect, Mrs. Kang, Zola said, holding the older woman's gaze steadily, I didn't detonate anything. Jiwoo did that the moment she walked into my wedding to threaten my marriage with a lie. I simply refused to let her lie stand unchallenged. There were other ways to handle it, Mi-suk said sharply. Privately, diplomatically, not in front of everyone whose opinion of this family actually matters for our business. Mother, Taejun said, his voice hardening. Are you genuinely more concerned about the Song family's business relationship than about the fact that Jiwoo blackmailed an innocent employee out of her job 2 years ago? I am concerned, Mi-suk said, about consequences you don't yet fully understand, because you have spent your entire life insulated from the actual mechanics of how this family's business survives. Song Industries provides 40% of our manufacturing components. Do you understand what happens if Chairman Song decides his daughter's public humiliation warrants ending that partnership? The room went quiet, the weight of the accusation settling heavily over all 3 of them. Then perhaps, Zola said finally, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. This family should consider whether it wants to build its future on partnerships that require covering for blackmail and coercion in order to remain intact. Mi-suk's eyes flashed, something sharp and dangerous crossing her features. You have been part of this family for exactly 1 hour, Zola. I would advise some humility before lecturing me on how 30 years of business relationships should be managed. Mother, that's enough, Taejun said firmly, stepping between them. Zola did nothing wrong today. She defended herself, and she defended BWAM, against a woman who walked into our wedding specifically to cause harm. If the Song family's business relationship with us depends on our silence about Jiwoo's behavior, then perhaps that relationship was never as stable as you've believed. Mi-suk looked at her son for a long moment, something shifting behind her carefully controlled expression, not quite softening, but recalculating. I received a call 20 minutes ago, she said finally, her voice quieter now. From Chairman Song himself. He wants a meeting. Tomorrow morning, before word of what happened here spreads any further than it already has. About what? Taejun asked warily. I don't know, Mi-suk admitted. He wouldn't say over the phone. Only that it was urgent, and that it concerned his daughter's conduct today. She looked between them both. I need both of you there. Whatever happens in that meeting will determine how this family's business relationships survive the next several years, and I will not walk into it without understanding exactly what actually happened here today. In full. Without either of you protecting me from uncomfortable details. Zola felt the weight of the coming morning settle over her. The wedding day's dramatic confrontation, apparently only the opening chapter of something far larger and more consequential than she'd initially understood. We'll be there, Taejun said, glancing at Zola, who nodded despite the exhaustion beginning to creep into her bones. Mi-suk studied Zola once more, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. For what it's worth, she said finally, her voice quieter, almost reluctant, what you did today took considerable courage. I am not certain yet whether it was wise, but I understand why you did it. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't full acceptance, but Zola recognized it, cautiously, as the first genuine crack in Mi-suk's carefully guarded composure since they'd met. Now, Mi-suk said, straightening, her formal mask sliding back into place, there is a reception waiting, 400 guests expecting celebration, and I suggest both of you compose yourselves before walking back out there. Whatever happens tomorrow can wait until tomorrow. She left the antechamber first, leaving Zola and Taejun alone for a brief, quiet moment. Some wedding day, Taeyun said finally, a tired, disbelieving laugh escaping him. Some wedding day, Zola agreed, allowing herself, finally, a small answering smile. Ask me again in 5 years if it was worth it. I already know the answer, Taeyun said, pulling her close. But ask me anyway, every year, and I'll tell you the same thing every time. They stepped back out into the hall together, toward 400 guests, and a reception that suddenly felt like only a brief reprieve before whatever waited for them the following morning. The song industry's headquarters occupied an entire block in Gangnam, and Zola felt the weight of its scale as their car pulled into the private executive entrance the next morning. Still faintly hungover on adrenaline and too little sleep, Chairman Song Min-jae received them in a boardroom on the 40th floor, spare and severe, glass walls overlooking the city. He was a tall man in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of stillness Zola had learned to associate with people who rarely needed to raise their voice to be obeyed. Ji-woo was not present. Zola noted that immediately, along with the visible relief it produced in Taejun's shoulders. Thank you for coming, Chairman Song said, gesturing to the seats across from him. Mi-suk and her husband, Chairman Kang, sat beside Taejun and Zola. The four of them arranged like negotiators on opposite sides of a treaty table. I imagine this is not how either family expected to spend the morning after a wedding. No, Taejun said carefully, it isn't. Chairman Song folded his hands on the table, studying them both for a long moment before speaking. I received a call, late last night, from 3 separate board members of companies my daughter sits on committees for. All 3 had heard, in remarkable detail, about what happened at your wedding yesterday. I understand a video exists. Several, in fact, taken by guests. They are apparently spreading quickly. Zola felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't considered the phones, the recordings, the inevitable digital afterlife of a scene played out in front of 400 witnesses. Chairman Song, Zola said carefully, I want to be clear. I didn't set out to humiliate your daughter publicly. She arrived at my wedding to accuse me of something false, in front of everyone I know. I responded to what she brought into that room. I didn't go looking for this confrontation. I'm aware, Chairman Song said, something unexpected entering his voice, not anger, Zola realized slowly. But something closer to weariness. I've spent the last 12 hours reviewing the messages Miss Han provided, along with several other documents my own legal team compiled overnight, once I understood the scope of what my daughter may have done. He paused. I want you to understand something, Mrs. Kang, before we discuss anything regarding our company's business relationship. I did not raise my daughter to threaten innocent employees out of their careers. Whatever she did 2 years ago, she did without my knowledge, and certainly without my approval. The room was quiet for a moment, the admission landing with unexpected weight. I believe you, Zola said finally. But I hope you understand, Chairman Song, that your daughter's actions still had real consequences for BWAM. Consequences that existed for 2 years regardless of what you did or didn't know about them. I understand completely, Chairman Song said, which is why I've already begun making arrangements. Miss Han will receive a formal, documented correction to her employment record, along with compensation for the career disruption my daughter's threats caused her. My legal team drafted the framework overnight. I'd like both families' input before finalizing it, but the intent is not negotiable. Taejun exchanged a glance with Zola, visible surprise crossing his features. That's more than I expected, given the circumstances. I run a company built on the trust of business partners across 3 continents, Chairman Song said simply. That trust does not survive if I allow my own daughter's misconduct to go uncorrected, simply because correcting it is uncomfortable. He paused, something more personal entering his controlled expression. And beyond the business calculation, Mr. Kang, I am, quite simply, ashamed of what my daughter did. I raised her to believe the world owed her very little, and to earn what she wanted through merit rather than coercion. I failed, apparently, in ways I am only now beginning to understand. Mi Suk, who had remained largely silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. And the business relationship between our companies? I received your call last night specifically because I understood it to be at risk. Chairman Song turned to her, something almost tired in his expression. Mrs. Kang, I called this meeting because I assumed, based on what I'd heard, that you might be seeking assurances about the manufacturing partnership. I want to address that directly. And I want to be honest in a way I suspect you were not entirely prepared for. He paused. The partnership continues, unconditionally, regardless of anything that happened at that wedding. It was never actually at risk. I would not punish a business relationship built over a decade because my daughter's poor judgment became public. If anything, Mrs. Kong, I am somewhat relieved this happened now, in a wedding cathedral, rather than years from now, in a context with far higher stakes. Zola watched Mi Suk absorb this, something shifting behind her carefully composed features, the recalculation of a threat that had, apparently, never actually existed outside her own assumptions. I appreciate the clarity, Chairman Song, Mi Suk said finally, her voice measured. I confess, I anticipated a considerably more difficult conversation this morning. I imagine you did, Chairman Song said, something almost wry entering his tone. I suspect that says more about how business relationships in our circles typically operate than it does about either of our families specifically. He turned back to Zola. Mrs. Kang, he said, using her married name deliberately, I want to say something directly to you, if you'll permit it. Please, Zola said. What you did yesterday required considerable courage, Chairman Song said. You could have deflected, de-escalated, allowed the confrontation to pass quietly, protected everyone's comfort at the expense of the truth. You chose instead to hold my daughter accountable, publicly, at real personal risk to your own wedding day and your own reputation. He paused. I do not know how to fully reconcile the daughter I raised with the daughter capable of what she did to Miss Han, but I am grateful, in a complicated way, that someone finally forced me to see it clearly. Where is Jiwoo now? Taejun asked carefully. Chairman Song's expression tightened slightly. She has resigned from every board position and executive role she held within our company, effective this morning. Whether that resignation is temporary or permanent depends, I think, on choices only she can make going forward. He paused. She is not, currently, in a place where I believe a conversation with either of you would be productive. But I wanted you both to know that what happened yesterday is being addressed, thoroughly, regardless of how uncomfortable that process becomes for our family. The meeting concluded shortly after, documents exchanged, frameworks agreed upon, the business machinery of 2 powerful families quietly recalibrating itself around the previous day's unexpected rupture. As they walked back toward the private elevator, Mi Suk fell into step beside Zola, something different in her posture than the guarded tension of the previous evening. I owe you an apology, Mi Suk said quietly, once Taejun had moved slightly ahead to speak with his father. Last night, in that antechamber, I was more concerned with business consequences than with the actual harm my son's ex-fiancée caused. That was a failure of priorities I am not proud of. Thank you for saying that, Zola said carefully. I am not accustomed to being wrong about these things, Mi Suk admitted, something almost vulnerable entering her voice. But I watched you yesterday, standing in that aisle, choosing truth over comfort even though it would have been so much easier not to. I think, perhaps, I have spent so long protecting this family's business interests that I forgot to ask what kind of family we actually wanted to be underneath them. Zola felt something loosen slightly in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since the antechamber confrontation the night before. I don't expect this to fix everything overnight, Mrs. Kang, Zola said honestly. But I appreciate you saying it. Mi-suk, the older woman corrected, something almost warm entering her expression for the first time. If you're going to be part of this family, Zola, I think it's time you called me by my name. They stepped into the elevator together, and as the doors closed, Zola caught Tae-jun watching the exchange with quiet, relieved surprise. The tension of the past 24 hours, finally, gradually, beginning to ease. But 3 floors down, unnoticed by any of them, a single black car remained parked outside the Song Industries building, Ji-woo sitting alone in the back seat, watching the entrance with an expression that suggested her story, despite everyone's assumptions, was far from finished. 2 weeks passed in relative quiet. BWAM's settlement was finalized, discreet and generous, along with a public correction to her employment record that quietly restored her professional reputation within the industry. Zola and Tae-jun settled into the early rhythms of married life, the wedding day's chaos gradually receding into the kind of story people tell at dinner parties once enough time has passed to make it feel survivable. Then, on a Tuesday morning, Zola's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Zola Kong?" A woman's voice asked, careful, hesitant, speaking. "My name is Han Ji-yeon. I'm a journalist with Seoul Economic Daily." A pause. "I'm working on a story about Song Ji-woo, and I was hoping you might be willing to comment." Zola felt something tighten in her chest. "What kind of story?" "There have been rumors," the journalist said carefully, "that Miss Song is planning to file a defamation lawsuit against you and Miss Han, alleging that the accusations made at your wedding were exaggerated, taken out of context, and caused irreparable damage to her reputation and career." Zola sat down slowly at her kitchen table, the quiet morning suddenly feeling considerably less stable than it had 5 minutes earlier. "I have no comment," Zola said carefully, beyond confirming that everything said at my wedding was true, and that documentation exists to support it. "Understood," the journalist said. "I'll be in touch if anything develops." Zola called Tae-jun immediately, then BWAM. The 3 of them converging that evening at Zola and Tae-jun's apartment, the earlier calm of married life replaced by the particular tension of a threat none of them had fully anticipated. "She's really doing this," BWAM said, pacing slowly across the living room, her earlier composure fraying at the edges. "After everything, after her own father corrected my employment record, she's going to sue us." "We have the messages," Tae-jun said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. The documentation Chairman Song's own legal team reviewed. How could a defamation case possibly succeed against that kind of evidence? "It doesn't need to succeed to cause damage," Zola said quietly, the reality settling over her with unwelcome clarity. "A lawsuit, even a weak one, generates headlines, doubt. The narrative shifts from woman held accountable for blackmail to legal dispute between feuding families, and suddenly the public conversation isn't about what she actually did anymore. It's about whether we're all just fighting over money and reputation." BWAM stopped pacing, her face draining of color. "I can't go through this publicly again, Zola. I only agreed to speak at the wedding because you called me, because it felt urgent, necessary. I'm not prepared for a prolonged legal battle playing out in the press." "You won't have to face it alone," Zola said firmly. "Whatever happens, we handle this together, all 3 of us." Tae-jun's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his expression tightening. "It's my mother," he answered, put it on speaker at Zola's nod. "I've heard the rumors," Mi-suk said without preamble, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I called Chairman Song directly an hour ago." "And?" Tae-jun asked. "He's furious," Mi-suk said. "Genuinely furious, not performing it for our benefit. Apparently Ji-woo filed initial paperwork with a lawyer without consulting him or the family's legal team at all. He's currently trying to determine whether he can legally stop her, given that she's an adult acting independently, or whether this is simply happening regardless of what he wants." "What does that mean for us?" Zola asked. "It means," Mi-suk said, "that Ji-woo appears to be acting entirely alone now, outside her family's support, which should tell you something about how desperate and isolated she's become since her resignation. It also means Chairman Song can no longer fully control the outcome, however much he wants to. The line went quiet for a moment. There's something else, Mi-suk said finally. Chairman Song mentioned that Ji-woo has been, in his words, unwell since her resignation, not eating properly, isolating herself, refusing most contact with family. He's worried, beneath the anger, about what this lawsuit represents for her state of mind, rather than simply her legal strategy. Zola felt something complicated stir beneath her own anxiety, not quite sympathy, but an uncomfortable awareness that the woman who'd tried to destroy her wedding day was also, apparently, unraveling in ways that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with genuine, unaddressed pain. What do we do? BWAM asked quietly. We prepare properly, Tae-jun said. Legal counsel, documentation review. Everything organized before this becomes public in any official capacity. He looked at Zola. But I think, given what my mother just said, we should also consider something else. What? Zola asked. Whether there's a way to address this that doesn't require another public confrontation, Tae-jun said carefully. Whether meeting with Ji-woo directly, privately, before this escalates into lawyers and headlines, might actually resolve something a courtroom never could. After everything she's done? BWAM asked, disbelief coloring her voice. I'm not suggesting we forgive her, or excuse any of it, Tae-jun said quickly. I'm suggesting that a woman spiraling this badly, filing lawsuits without her own family's knowledge, isolating herself from everyone who might offer perspective, is not a woman thinking clearly. And I don't know that escalating this into a prolonged public legal battle actually serves any of us, even if we'd ultimately win. Zola considered this carefully, weighing the exhaustion of the past 2 weeks against the genuine uncertainty of what a legal battle might cost all of them. Financially and emotionally, regardless of outcome. I need to think about it, Zola said finally. But Tae-jun, if we do this, if we try one more conversation before lawyers get fully involved, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing it to protect Ji-woo from consequences. I'm doing it, if I do it at all, because I don't want BWAM carrying the weight of a public legal battle that was never her responsibility to begin with. BWAM looked at her, something grateful and exhausted crossing her face. Thank you, she said quietly. Zola's phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number, 3 words, sent with no context, no explanation. I need help. Zola stared at the screen for a long moment before showing it to Tae-jun, who read it with visibly growing concern. Is that he started? I don't know, Zola said slowly, but I think we're about to find out. Zola stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly. Song Ji-woo. Please, I don't know who else to call. Zola showed the screen to Tae-jun and BWAM, both of them reading it in tense silence. This could be a trap, BWAM said carefully. Something to use against us later. A recorded call, a manipulated context it could be. Zola agreed. Or it could be exactly what it looks like. She looked at Tae-jun. Your mother said she wasn't eating, isolating herself. That's not the profile of someone building a careful legal strategy. That's someone in crisis. Tae-jun exhaled slowly. What do you want to do? Zola thought of Ji-woo standing frozen in the cathedral doorway, all that brittle confidence finally cracking under the weight of her own choices. She thought of Chairman Song's genuine, weary shame. She thought of BWAM, still carrying 2 years of quiet fear that this woman had inflicted on her without ever facing real consequences, until a wedding day forced the truth into the open. I want to call her, Zola said finally. Not alone. Somewhere safe. Somewhere public enough that none of us feel unsafe, but private enough that she can actually speak honestly if that's really what this is. They met the following afternoon at a quiet corner cafe, chosen deliberately for its neutral ground nowhere near either family's usual circles, nowhere that carried the weight of business or wedding or courtroom implications. Shiwo arrived first, and when Zola walked in with Tae-jun and BWAM, She barely recognized the woman sitting alone at the corner table. Gone was the sharp red dress, the sleek confidence, the carefully constructed poise. Jiwoo sat in a plain gray sweater, her hair pulled back without styling, dark circles beneath eyes that looked, for the first time since Zola had known of her, entirely without armor. "Thank you for coming," Jiwoo said quietly, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "All three of you. I wasn't sure you would." "We almost didn't," BWAM said honestly, sitting down carefully, her body language still guarded. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Jiwoo finally spoke. "I withdrew the lawsuit this morning," she said quietly. "Before you arrived. I wanted you to know that first." Zola felt something loosen slightly in her chest, though she remained cautious. "Why?" "Because filing it was never actually about winning," Jiwoo said, her voice raw, stripped of its earlier performance. "It was about control. About proving to myself that I still had some power left, after losing everything else: my engagement, my board positions, my father's trust, my own sense of who I thought I was." She looked up finally, meeting BWAM's eyes directly. "I've spent 2 weeks trying to figure out how to live with what I did to you. I don't think a lawsuit was ever going to help with that. I think it was just another way of avoiding it." "What changed?" Taejun asked carefully. "My father sat me down 3 days ago," Jiwoo said. "He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He just asked me one question, over and over, until I finally had to actually answer it honestly instead of deflecting." She paused. "He asked me who I wanted to become, now that all the things I'd built my identity around were gone. And I realized I didn't have an answer, because I'd never once built an identity around anything except being someone's fiancée, someone's daughter, someone's competitor. I never built one around who I actually wanted to be." BWAM was quiet for a long moment, studying Jiwoo with an expression that mixed lingering wariness with something more complicated. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Jiwoo continued, looking at BWAM directly now. "I don't think I've earned that, and I don't think 2 weeks of realizing I was wrong erases 2 years of you carrying what I did to you. But I wanted to say it directly, to your face, without lawyers or families or wedding guests watching. I am sorry. Genuinely, completely sorry, for threatening your career, for making you afraid to tell the truth for 2 years, for the version of myself that thought your friendship with Taejun was something I was entitled to destroy." BWAM's eyes glistened, though her voice remained steady. "It cost me 2 years, Jiwoo. 2 years of building my career back from nothing, of being afraid every time I applied for a new job that somehow your version of events would surface first." "I know," Jiwoo said quietly. "I can't undo that. I know an apology doesn't return those 2 years to you. But I needed you to hear it anyway." The caf fell quiet for a long moment, 4 people sitting with the weight of everything that had happened since a cathedral door slammed open 3 weeks earlier. "What happens now?" Zola asked finally. "For you, I mean." "I don't know yet," Jiwoo admitted. "My father's given me time, space to figure it out, without the pressure of board positions or business expectations. I think, for the first time in my life, I actually need that." She looked at Zola. "I owe you an apology too. Walking into your wedding, trying to humiliate you in front of everyone you love, that was cruel, and it was never actually about you. You were just standing in the space I'd convinced myself belonged to me." "I accept that," Zola said carefully. "I'm not sure we'll ever be close, Jiwoo, but I don't need us to be, for this to matter." They left the caf separately. No dramatic resolution, no sudden friendship forged from crisis, just 4 people who had walked through something painful and complicated, arriving at something quieter and more honest than any of them had expected when the day began. 6 months later, Zola stood in the doorway of a small non-profit office in Seoul's Mapo district, watching BWAM, now the organization's newly appointed director, walk a group of young professional women through a workshop on recognizing workplace coercion and protecting their careers. The nonprofit had been BWAM's idea, funded quietly by the Song family as part of Chairman Song's ongoing effort to make amends, though BWAM had insisted on building and running it entirely on her own terms. Taejun found Zola in the doorway, slipping an arm around her waist. "She's good at this," he said, watching BWAM field a question from one of the younger attendees with easy, confident warmth. She always was, Zola said. She just needed the chance to prove it without someone else's fear controlling the outcome. Later that evening, a text arrived from an unexpected number, Ji-woo, checking in periodically now, months into what she'd quietly described as figuring out who I actually want to be. This message was simple. A photo of a small community garden project she'd started volunteering with. A single sentence beneath it. Small steps. Thank you for not letting me disappear into the worst version of myself. Zola looked at the photo for a long moment, then set the phone down, turning back to Taejun, and the quiet, ordinary evening stretching out ahead of them. No cathedrals, no cameras, no families in crisis, just the settled, hard-won piece of a marriage that had survived its most dramatic beginning and come out steadier for it. If this story had you gripping your seat through that cathedral scene, drop a comment telling me what you would have said if you were standing at that altar, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Subscribe for more stories about women who refuse to be silenced and the truth that always finds its way to the light. See you in the next one.